Do you remember that 1950s longline bra that I drafted and sewed and simply raved about on this channel? Well, I have a very exciting announcement for you all. I am now releasing the pattern for this bra for you to use for free on my blog. So many of you expressed interest in the pattern, so I decided to release it all to you in a user-friendly format for free on my blog. I'm going to get into more of the details of this pattern and how to use it in a moment, so stay tuned. Now, why did I release this pattern for free? My time is quite limited and I really wanted to get the pattern out to you as soon as possible. So the pattern does come in only the one size that I drafted for myself, and it's hand drawn because I'm just not techie enough at this point or have enough time to figure out how to digitize it all neatly and perfectly, but I did trace it out as neatly as I could and took very accurate and clear photos of it, which are what you're going to get when you go to the blog for the pattern. If I were releasing this pattern for sale, I probably would have graded it into multiple sizes, added seam allowance, by the way, more on seam allowance later, and I would have digitized the pattern all neatly and perfectly, but at this stage in my life, that just isn't realistic in terms of my time and expertise. So free, low-tech pattern it is, but I still think you will get immense value from it, especially once you watch this video with the adjustment and other instructions for the pattern. If you're interested in vintage bras, I have a couple videos about vintage bras on my channel that you will want to check out first. The first video from a couple months ago or so is about vintage bras and why they are, in my opinion, leagues better than modern bras in their supportiveness and attractiveness. The second video is all about the making of my very own vintage bra, so definitely check that out if you are interested in vintage bras and if you plan on using this free pattern that I'm releasing to you all, because that will be your main instructions for how to sew it. But I'm also going to add more details in this video and the accompanying blog post for anything that wasn't covered in that original making video. Why no seam allowance? First of all, let's talk about the pattern itself. Why doesn't it include seam allowances? First of all, this is how I personally strongly prefer all of my own bra and corset patterns to be, because it is more accurate and it's much easier to adjust to your own body size when there's no seam allowance involved. What do I mean when I say it's more accurate? Here's what I mean. When you're ready to trace out the pattern and cut it out from your fabric, you are able to trace directly around the pattern, and that will be your very clear stitching line for when you're later sewing it, rather than those patterns where the seam allowance is already included and then you're just completely relying on the fact that your sewing machine seam allowance guide is going to be accurate and that you're going to be able to accurately sew along that seam allowance guide the whole time. In this method, you get a clear stitching line drawn onto the fabric for you, and you can just sew over that. So that way, if your seam allowance doesn't end up being cut uniformly or sewn uniformly, you'll always have that clear stitching line to follow. So the way it works is that you trace around the pattern piece onto your fabric. This is what I personally do, and then I'll just take my clear quilting ruler, my clear drafting ruler I should say, and I mark around either a 1 centimeter seam allowance or a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and I cut out the first half of the garment in that way. And then after that, since I have the first half of the pattern pieces cut already, then I'll simply cut around those pieces as a guide, and I won't have to manually add the seam allowance. And I can later trace out the stitching line onto those second half of the pattern pieces. Now, if you would rather simply add your seam allowance to the paper pattern, that's totally fine. Everyone has their own personal way of working. So you would just do that by tracing around it with your clear drafting or quilting ruler and adding your desired seam allowance and then cutting it out like that. Now, regardless of what method you use, either the method I said that I prefer or adding your seam allowance to the paper pattern, either way, you're going to need to make a decision about what width of seam allowances you're going to use. Which leads me to my next point of why I chose not to add seam allowances to this particular pattern. That reason is that I actually recommend in most cases, to actually use 2 different widths of seam allowances for different areas of the bra. Now, this sounds really confusing. Why did I do this? The reason is that generally when you're sewing a bra, especially bra cups, which have a lot of panels and they're very curved, it is a better idea to use a smaller seam allowance. I personally used a 1 cm seam allowance. Now normally I would just use the same seam allowance for the entire bra pattern, but the problem with that is that this particular long line bra pattern has boning channels that are created from sewing flat felled seams between the body panels. And to create flat felled seams that are wide enough for a boning channel, there needs to be at least a 1.5 cm seam allowance. So the way that I personally added seam allowances to my pattern when I sewed it is that I did a 1.5 cm seam allowance on all of the body panels and all of those straight seams that go down the rib cage to the waist. And then on all of the cup seams involved up here, I did a 1 cm seam allowance. Again, having the smaller seam allowance in the cups just gives you greater accuracy and ease when you're sewing with these curved seams. But of course, the way you choose to add seam allowances to your pattern and the types of seams you choose to use is completely up to you. You don't have to do flat felled seams in the body if you don't want to. You could create boning channels by sewing bias tape over top of the seams or some other type of twill tape or something like that, in which case you could use 1 cm seam allowance for all of the seams. Because there's just so many different ways that one could sew this bra pattern, that's why I chose to just leave the seam allowance out and leave it up to you as the user. Let's talk about my fabric recommendations if you're planning on making this bra. I recommend using a lightweight woven fabric for this bra, like satin, batiste, lightweight linen, even cotton muslin perhaps, etc. I have also included in the pattern a triangular elastic gusset at the side of the waistline for greater comfort. This is just something that I thought after wearing my own bra that would probably be a good idea, just to add that little bit of comfort and breathability at the side of your waist right there. If you want to make your bra extra comfy or to have a more modern looking bra, then you could also just go ahead and use a modern bra band fabric like Power Mesh, which is stretchy but still supportive, and it's usually somewhat see-through, and you could use that for either just the back panels of the bra or the whole bra band itself. It's completely up to you. Either way, if you are going for that vintage bra look, I would recommend using a non-stretch fabric, at least in the cups. That's what's going to give you that vintage, really supported bra look. If you do choose to use Power Mesh for all of the bra band, it could potentially create a slightly less supportive bra, but if you're more concerned with comfort than the supportive level, then do whatever feels good to you. So I'm going to refer you to my other video and blog post on the making of my 1950s long line bra for all of the instructions on how to sew this bra. If you have any further questions, just feel free to send me an email or talk to me on Instagram or even leave me a YouTube comment. One thing I would like to note is that if you refer back to that video, it's clearly called a long line bullet bra, and I would still consider this bra pattern that I'm releasing to you to be a bullet bra. It's more in that direction. It does have a somewhat more pointy look because of how it's designed, but it is less pointy than my original pattern, because if you do watch through that entire video, you'll notice that I altered it at the very end because I found it just a bit too extreme. So I just softened up that point a little bit, and that is the version of the pattern that I'm choosing to release to you all, because I just think it's what looks the best and it's going to be the most accessible and comfortable shape for most people out there to work with and to wear, especially in a modern lifestyle. Now there's a couple more things I'd like to note that may not have been clear enough from that original bra construction video that are very important. The first one is the importance of stay stitching around any panels that have curved seams. So in terms of the bra cups, this means you're going to be stay stitching around the entire perimeter of all of the bra cup areas as well as the top frame pieces. If you're unfamiliar with what stay stitching is, all it is just sewing with a smaller stitch length just outside of the stitching line of the finished bra. So it's going to be within the seam allowance but very close to the stitching line. And what it does is it prevents the fabric from stretching out as you're working with it, which is very likely to happen in any panel that's cut on the bias of the fabric, which is stretchy. So that's why we stay stitch before we do anything else. I'd also like to mention something you're going to see in the pattern for the center front interfacing. I actually created 2 separate pattern pieces just for the interfacing of the center front area. The reason I just did a whole separate pattern piece is because I wanted to show you that I recommend cutting interfacing just for this straight area up here on the straight of grain, and then cutting a whole separate piece of interfacing also on the straight of grain that will go up here. Now in the actual outer pattern piece, these are connected. There's just one piece that goes all the way up here. But the problem with that is that it means that this area of the bra is completely on the bias. And because of the type of bra it is, I do think it's good to have this top frame on the neckline to be on the straight of grain. It just really helps the supportiveness of this bra. So it's up to you, but I do personally recommend cutting this interfacing piece on the straight of grain. I did just use woven fusible interfacing for this. It made it easier for me. So now let's jump into the detailed directions for measuring yourself and then altering the bra pattern to suit your own body shape and size. Okay, so the first step is going to be measuring yourself. So you're going to want to be wearing a well-supporting bra and possibly nothing else, and have a measuring tape, of course. The first measurement we're going to take is your waist measurement. And this is, of course, if you plan for your bra to go all the way down to your waist. Your waist is the point at which your body will naturally bend when you're bending sideways. Now here I'm just demonstrating that if you don't want your bra to go all the way down to your waist, then simply measure your body's circumference at the point at which you want your bra to end. Okay, so now we're going to be taking our under bust measurement. So this also corresponds to your bra band area, but you don't want to skip this step and simply go with your bra band size, because this usually doesn't correspond to the actual measurement. Okay, so here we're taking a new measurement. It's called your bottom cup depth measurement, and in my opinion, it's the most accurate way to measure for a handmade bra. So we're going to be measuring from the bottom of your breast where it meets your body, also on the underwire line, and measure up to your bust apex, which is roughly where your nipple will be sitting, and it's the fullest point of the breast. For me, it's about 10 centimeters. Now another measurement that I forgot to show you is your underbust to waist measurement, and this is a vertical measurement, just measuring the height of your body starting at your underbust line and going down to your waistline, or the place at which you want the bra to end. So now let's talk about adjusting the pattern to fit your body. The first adjustments we're going to work on are our vertical adjustments. So this is if you want the bra to be either longer or shorter than the pattern in order to fit you better. So this is where that underbust to waist measurement is going to come in handy. And in order to adjust your pattern, you're going to need a clear drafting or quilting ruler, a pencil, a tape measure, and some tape and scissors. Okay, so for a length adjustment, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to mark a place on each pattern piece, and you're going to want that place to be at the same level across all of the pattern pieces. And it's going to be roughly in the middle of each pattern piece from top to bottom. And that's going to be where you either lengthen or shorten your pattern. So here you can see I've gotten the line marked on all of them, and it's at the same height on all of them. So now, let's say you're going to shorten your pattern. You're going to cut across that line, separate your pattern piece into 2 separate pieces now. Don't worry, this is temporary. And then let's say we want to shorten our pattern by 1 centimeter of height. So you'll mark down 1 centimeter, draw a straight line, and then tape the top piece down to that marking, overlapping them to shorten the pattern. And then afterwards, you'll just have to smooth out those side lines to make sure they're still straight. Now let's say you want to lengthen your pattern. You'll have to add an extra piece of paper in the middle. Of course, measure the distance that you want to lengthen by. So let's say we're doing by 1 centimeter. You're going to mark a line 1 centimeter down and tape your bottom pattern piece to this line, adding that extra 1 centimeter of vertical space, which lengthens the pattern. And of course, just trimming off those side pieces now to make the sides nice and straight. Okay, let's talk about how to do a width adjustment. This is something you're going to want to do after you've done the vertical adjustments. So let's just say we want to add more width to all of our pattern pieces. First of all, be sure to check out the blog post where I elaborate on how you're going to figure out how much width you need to add to each individual pattern piece. But once you have this figure, you go ahead and you just measure out the amount of width that you need extra to add. You add that out at the top and at the bottom, and then you add a nice line grading those two markings into each other. And this line will be your new seam line for that pattern piece. And then just transfer your notches to this new line and erase the old one. Okay, so let's talk about how to adjust the cups. This is where that bottom cup depth measurement is going to come in handy. So let's just say that your bottom cup depth was only 9 centimeters, so it's 1 centimeter shorter than this particular pattern is drafted for. So you're going to want to mark up that center seam of the cup, which corresponds to the bottom cup depth measurement, and mark your 9 centimeter marking. And you're going to draw a new cup seam line coming out from that 9 centimeter marking. So bringing that top edge of the cup down by 1 centimeter. And transfer your notches, of course. And you're going to do this to the other cup pattern pieces. And for the top cup panels, you're going to want to reduce them by about the same amount, by about 1 centimeter. And of course, you're going to have to test this out with the mock-up just to make sure that it fits you and that further adjustments aren't needed. And so you can see our cup panels are now smaller. So now I'm just going to show you how you would go about adding seam allowance to your paper pattern if this is something that you prefer to do rather than adding it to the fabric like I described earlier. You're just going to mark out with a clear drafting or quilting ruler your desired seam allowance onto the pattern. And make sure you note that you have included seam allowance. And that's how you do it. Just repeat on all the sides. Okay everyone, I really hope you found all of these instructions helpful, and good luck if you plan on using this pattern. Be sure to check out the accompanying blog post for this, which will have everything I just said in its written version along with photos, so it should be very helpful if you're planning on using this pattern and adjusting it to your body. I would love to hear from you if you're planning on using this pattern, and of course I would be thrilled to hear your experience working with it after you're done sewing it. And if you'd love to post a picture of the bra, it doesn't have to be yourself wearing it. If you could just post a picture of any bras that you make and tag me on Instagram, that would be wonderful. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.